Curious George goes to the amusement park. Today's the opening of the new amusement park, George, said the man with the yellow hat. Let's go. They got into their little blue car and drove off. At the park entrance, they saw Yvonne. She was with her Aunt Ruby, who was wearing her new watch. We can't stay very long, said the aunt. I know, said Yvonne. We only have $1 for rides. George, why don't you get the tickets, said the man. I'll park the car, and don't get into trouble. The ticket booth was closed, but one of the windows was open just enough for a little monkey to get in. George wiggled through the window. A lever was sticking up from the counter. What was it for? George was curious. He pulled the lever. A roll of tickets popped up, and the ticket window opened. Now children came running from everywhere. Yvonne was the first in line. I didn't know you had a job selling tickets, George, she said. All I have is $1. How many tickets can I get? George pressed a button, and out came the tickets. Wow, Yvonne said happily. Aunt Ruby will be surprised. George gave tickets to the next person, and the next one, and the next one. Soon a long line had formed at the ticket window. Everybody got free tickets from George. Finally, the real ticket seller arrived. What's going on? He cried. Who's inside the booth? He ran to the door and unlocked it. A monkey? He shouted. Stop it! How dare you give away my tickets for free? George was scared. Quickly, he escaped through the window and ran away. Guard! Shouted the ticket seller. Stop that monkey! A guard blew his whistle, and they both ran after George. But George had disappeared in the amusement park. What a place it was. There was the Balloon Man, and the House of Mirrors, and the roller coaster, and the merry-go-round. There were places to eat and drink, and music was playing all over. George ran into the House of Mirrors. How funny he looked. First, tall, then short, then fat. But the owner chased him out. George had no ticket. He ran over to the roller coaster. Aunt Ruby and Yvonne were just coasting by. Something flew through the air. George saw it land on the woodwork. How good that George was a monkey. He climbed up the woodwork and got hold of it. It was Aunt Ruby's handbag. George picked it up and jumped to the ground. When the roller coaster had stopped, everybody got off. That was fun, said Yvonne. Not for me, said Aunt Ruby. I lost my new handbag. Let's look for it. And then she saw George. Look, she shouted. George found my handbag. She rushed over and hugged him. Thank you so much, she said. Just then, a hand reached out and grabbed George. It was the ticket seller. He was angry. I finally found you, he shouted. You come with me. George was scared. One moment, please, said Aunt Ruby. Just look how many children are waiting in line over there to buy your tickets. George started that line. Besides, he found my bag. Please don't be angry with him. Well, said the ticket seller, if you put it that way, I guess I'll just have to forget about it. Let's shake hands, George. Just then, the man with the yellow hat joined them. How about a ride for everybody? The treat's on me. So, they all went on the roller coaster again. Curious George at the airport. A friend of mine is coming today, George, said the man with the yellow hat. He is flying all the way from Africa to see us. Let's go meet him at the airport. The parking lot at the airport was full of cars, but George and his friend finally found an empty place. Let's remember where we parked, said the man with the yellow hat, so we don't get lost on the way back. Inside the airport, there were lots of people rushing back and forth. There were big people with small bags and small people with big bags. There were bags that had pockets and bags that had little wheels on the bottom. "Follow me and don't get lost, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "We're going to meet my friend in the place where the people pick up their luggage." "Here comes the luggage," said a man, and people started to crowd around the belt to find their bags. Where did the belt go to? George was curious. He jumped on it. The belt went through another little door and outside to the back of the building. People in uniforms were standing there, loading on more luggage from a big wagon. Right next to this belt, there was another belt. George jumped over to it. Where did that one go? It emptied into a different baggage place. George looked around. Where was he now? How could he get back to his friend, the man with the yellow hat? He was scared. He ran down another long hall. Was he lost? There was a door. It went right to the top floor of the airport. From up here, George could see everything. Suddenly, far away, George saw a man in a yellow hat who was getting off a plane. George was curious. It couldn't be his friend. Who was it? A girl with binoculars was standing nearby. "Are you looking for someone?" "You can look through my glasses. It makes things look bigger." The man in the yellow hat was someone else. George didn't know what to do next. "Don't worry," said the girl with the binoculars. "I'll help you find your friend. There's a special place for people who are lost. I'll take you there. Your friend will be sure to find you." The girl led him down a staircase and past a sign that said, "This way to the lost and found." And there, inside was his friend, the man with the yellow hat. "George, there you are," he shouted. "Now you can meet my friend from Africa." And what do you know? It was the man in the other yellow hat that George had seen through the binoculars. "My friend had a long trip, George," said the man. "Let's take him home so he can rest. How would you like to lead the way?" George knew just how to get back to the car. And then the three of them got in their little blue car and went back home. Curious George goes to an ice cream shop. George and his friend, the man with the yellow hat, were cleaning house. "We've worked hard today," said the man. "Let's go and get some ice cream." So they got in their little blue car and drove to town. "Look, George, there's a new place on Main Street," said the man. "Looks good. Let's give it a try." "We've come to taste your ice cream," said the man. "I'm glad someone has," said Mr. Herb, the owner. "Come on in. I just opened the place and no one knows I'm here." "I'll have a strawberry cone," said the man with the yellow hat. Mr. Herb dipped out a scoop of strawberry. "I have some errands to do, George," said the man. "Have some ice cream, but don't get into trouble." "Take your time, George," said Mr. Herb. "I've got a lot to do." George couldn't make up his mind. He looked around. There were so many flavors. Mr. Herb was filling a bowl with ice cream. "This is a special order for a party," he said. "My first big one since the store opened. It's got to be just right." George was curious. Could he do that too? When Mr. Herb went to answer the phone, George climbed on the counter and picked up the scoop. He dipped it in the banana ice cream and put it in the bowl. Then he dug into the strawberry and put it next to the banana. Then the nutty walnut, then raspberry, then vanilla. Soon there was a mountain of ice cream in the bowl. George was just about to put orange sherbet on top of peppermint pink when Mr. Herb returned. "George," he yelled, "that's not what my customer ordered. Now I have to start all over again. Get away from here." Mr. Herb was angry. George ran over to the other counter in front of the window. There were jars of cherries, nuts, coconut chips, whipped cream, and all kinds of sauces. There was even a bowl of bananas. Suddenly, George was hungry. He put some bananas in a dish. Then he added raspberries, chocolate chips, and whipped cream. That looked good. There was a tapping on the window. George turned around. Outside, there were lots of children cheering and pointing at him. "Add some nuts, George," called a boy. "Try the sprinkles," said a girl. "Don't forget the cherry on top." How could George forget the cherry? Just as George was about to taste his masterpiece, Mr. Herb came over. He was still angry. But before he could scold George, the crowd rushed in. What a great idea to have George working in the window. "I want a raspberry sundae," said the man. "And I'll have a banana split," said another. Mr. Herb could hardly keep up. The orders kept pouring in. Finally, everyone was served, and Mr. Herb was delighted. "Thanks, George," he said, "for all those customers. I was angry with you when you messed up my big order, but you sure made up for it." Just then, the man with the yellow hat came back. "Have you finally decided what flavor you want, George?" "He sure did," said Mr. Herb. "A little bit of everything." Curious George goes to a restaurant. Today, George and the man with the yellow hat had been working hard in their garden. "I think we deserve a break, don't you, George? Let's go to a restaurant for dinner." George was hungry, so they got in their little blue car and drove off to the restaurant. It was a busy place. In one corner, a large birthday party was going on. As they came in the restaurant, George and the man met Mr. Anders, the owner. "Welcome," he said, and showed them to a table in a quiet corner. "George," said the man with the yellow hat, "I see a friend over there. I'll be right back." George looked around. A waiter carried an empty tray through a swinging door. A little later, he came out with a different tray. This one had dishes with covers on them. What was under those covers? George was curious. The waiter left the tray on a side table to see another customer. George sneaked over, jumped up, and started lifting the covers off the dishes. The food smelled good. George tasted a lamb chop first. Then he tried some mashed potato. Finally, he found a banana. It was delicious. But now it was time for him to get back to his table. As he jumped down, another waiter came through the door and tripped over him. Dishes went flying. Food spilled all over everyone. "Who did this?" shouted Mr. Anders. "It was that monkey," said a lady. George got scared. Before anyone could see him, he quickly ran into the kitchen. He looked around. One of the cooks was talking to a man. They were looking at something that George couldn't see. "I don't know if this looks special enough for my son," said the man. What was going on? George was curious. He jumped up on the table. There was a beautiful birthday cake. "Look at that monkey," said the man. "Good heavens, I'll get rid of him right away, sir," said the cook. Just then, Mr. Anders ran into the kitchen. "There he is, grab him," he shouted. "Wait," said the man. "Maybe he's just what we need." Meanwhile, the children at the birthday party were ready for dessert. Suddenly, the kitchen door opened and out came a big surprise. A birthday cake with a monkey on it. The children clapped and laughed. "That's Curious George," they shouted. "Hiya, George." George jumped off the cake and went over to the children. A little later, he joined his friend, the man with the yellow hat. Soon, the birthday boy came over and gave him 2 big pieces of cake. "Thank you, George," he said. "This was the best party I ever had." Then Mr. Anders came over. "I hope you'll come again soon, George," he said. "You can help me with another birthday party." Finally, George and his friend waved goodbye to Mr. Anders and drove off in their little blue car. Curious George goes fishing. "George, it's a beautiful day for going fishing," said the man with the yellow hat. George helped his friend with the fishing rods. They got in their little blue car and drove to the country. "This might be a good place," said the man. "I'll go and look for a shallow spot. You wait here and don't get into trouble." Then the man waded into the water. But what should George do now? He decided to swing through the trees. Around the bend, he saw a family having a picnic. The mother and the 2 little girls, Karen and Ann, were preparing dinner. The father was catching fish. He threw out the line and it landed in the water. Sometimes he caught a fish, and sometimes he didn't. George was watching. After a while, the man picked up his fish and went back to his family. This was George's chance. He went over, picked up the rod, and flicked it. The hook caught on the frying pan. George tugged as hard as he could to loosen it. But instead, he pulled the pan off. It flipped high in the air. The family's dinner went flying. "Oh, no," the mother cried. "There goes our dinner."
Who did that?
George got scared. It was time to get away. Then the father tried to catch more fish. But this time, his luck was bad. The fish had all gone somewhere else. Finally, he gave up. The family went to see if they had any other food in their car. Now George was safe. What next? He picked up some pebbles and threw them in the water. Just then, a fish leaped up. Then another. Then 2 more. So that was where the fish were. They were swimming under the shade of the tree. Now George knew what to do. After a while, the family came back. They had not found any food. "I'll try again," said the father. But now the fishing rods were gone. "Look over there," shouted Ann. George was fishing with all 4 rods. "He's got a bite," cried Karen. "2 bites," cried Ann. "3," said the father. "4," they all cried. "Come on, George, don't let them get away." He tugged and he pulled, and he caught 4 fat, shiny fish. Later, George and the man with the yellow hat were invited for dinner. It was a delicious meal, especially for George. Soon, George and the man with the yellow hat got in their little blue car and drove back home. Curious George goes to the zoo. "It's been a long time since we've been to the zoo, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Why don't we go?" It was a good idea. So they got into their little blue car and drove off. was a lot to see at the zoo. First, there were the giraffes with their long necks. So long, they seemed to reach to the clouds. Then there were the elephants with their floppy ears and the biggest noses George had ever seen. Then came the kangaroos, carrying their babies in a special pocket in their tummies. And then there were the seals. It was lunchtime, and many people were eating all around, in small cafes, on the park benches, and even on the grass. George was getting very hungry. "I'm going to find out what time they're going to feed the lions," said his friend. "You stay here and watch the seals until I come back. And don't get into trouble." George watched for a while. The keeper was feeding the seals some fish. It made George even hungrier. He wandered off. A keeper was walking by, carrying a pail with food for the monkeys. He stopped at the water fountain to get a drink and put the pail down. George grabbed the pail and ran away with it. "Hey, you!" the keeper shouted. "Somebody stop that monkey!" And he ran after George. George kept on running and held onto the pail. There was a crowd of people near the monkey house. Just the place for George to hide. Now he was safe. A little boy was standing near the cage. He was holding on to a red balloon with a long string. One of the monkeys reached out and snatched the string from the boy's hand. Then he ran up to the top of the cage and tried to squeeze the balloon through the bars. But the bars were too narrow. The other monkeys gathered and started to shriek and scream. The little boy was crying. "Please, couldn't somebody get his balloon back?" asked the mother. But nobody could reach up that high. How good that George was a monkey. He climbed up to the top of the cage. Then he took a few bananas from the pail and fed it to the monkeys. While they were all eating, George got hold of the balloon, swung down from the cage, and handed the balloon back to the boy. Everybody cheered and clapped. Just then, the man with the yellow hat came running over, followed by the keeper. "George," the man cried, "where have you been? I've been looking all over for you." "Please don't be angry with him," said the mother. "He saved my son's balloon." And she gave George a big kiss. "Well," said the keeper, "George did take my pail, and that wasn't a good thing. But he did feed the monkeys." And he smiled. "And now," said the man with the yellow hat, "it's time to go home, George. We've got to get something to eat, too." And that's just what they did. Curious George goes skiing. "Would you like to learn how to ski today, George?" said the man with the yellow hat. "There's a new ski lift opening." So off they went in their little blue car to the ski lift. A crowd of skiers were waiting at the bottom of the hill. The lift carried the people up to the top. From there, they could ski down and start all over. The owner looked worried. "The trick skiers are not coming," he said. "I don't know what I'll do." George's friend wanted to buy some tickets for the ski lift. "You can look around, George," he said. "Watch out for the skiers coming down and don't get into trouble." George looked around. Some workmen were building a refreshment stand. Nearby, there was a large rack full of skis. A skier would take a pair of skis, strap them on, ride up the ski lift, and ski down the hill. George was watching the skiers. Could he do it too? George was curious. He went to the rack and picked the smallest pair of skis. Then he tried to put them on. How did that go? He pressed the catch. Ouch! George jumped and nearly lost his balance and started sliding backwards. First slowly, then faster and faster, right toward another ski rack. "Stop!" cried one of the workmen, but George couldn't. He banged right into that lumber that they were using to build the refreshment stand. "Who did that?" shouted another workman. "It's that monkey," someone else cried. And they all ran after George. George was scared. The skiers were getting on the ski lift. As it passed by, George jumped up and grabbed a chair. The lift was on its way up the mountain, and the angry men were down below. When the lift was almost to the top, George jumped off. As soon as he landed, he started sliding down the trail. He wanted to stop, but he didn't know how. He skied down and disappeared into a clump of trees. The crowd was still waiting for the trick skiers. The owner had to tell them that there would not be a show today. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. "Here comes a monkey on skis," a little girl cried. Everyone looked up. George came speeding down over a big bump. He flew high into the air. The crowd held its breath. Luckily, George landed on his feet, then made a turn. Then 2 more turns. George was getting closer to the big jump. There was no way to stop. He flew through the air. The crowd clapped and cheered. "Hooray!" they cried. "What a trick!" Just then, one of the workmen ran over. "That's the monkey who made all the mess," he shouted. George was trapped. "Wait!" cried the owner as he rushed over, followed by the man with the yellow hat. George shouldn't have knocked over all that wood, but he did save the day with his tricks. "How about one more?" someone in the crowd shouted. "Before you do any more tricks," said the man with the yellow hat, "you'd better take some lessons. You've had enough for one day. Let's go home." And that's just what they did. Curious George goes to a costume party. "George," said the man with the yellow hat, "Aunt Harriet has just invited us to a party. It sounds like fun. Let's go." So off they went in their little blue car. Aunt Harriet lived in an old house with many rooms and a large attic. "Hello, George," she said. "I'm so glad you could come. The other guests will be here soon. But where is your costume? I must have forgotten to tell your friend that we're having a costume party. Since you don't have one, maybe you can make one up. There's lots of things upstairs." "George," said the man, "I'll just use my hat as a costume. You go up to the attic, but don't get into trouble." George went upstairs. The attic was full of old furniture, a mirror, and boxes full of old clothes. George looked into one of the boxes. There was an old fireman's hat. George put it on and looked in the mirror. But the hat was too big for him. In another box was a sailor's suit. George tried it on. Too big again. The doorbell rang downstairs. The guests must be arriving. George had to find a costume in a hurry. On top of an old dresser was a lot of white cloth. What could that be? George was curious. He reached up and pulled at it. He pulled and pulled and pulled. Finally, the sheet came off the dresser, and with it came the old lamp. The lamp hit the floor and broke into 100 pieces. Now George was all wrapped up. The more he tried to get out, the more wrapped up he became. He looked into the mirror but he could hardly see through the sheet. Then he heard some voices coming from downstairs. "Did you hear a crash upstairs?" someone asked. "What was that noise?" "I hope nothing has happened to George," said Aunt Harriet. George was scared. He ran down the stairs and kept running. The big white sheet floated behind him. "Look," someone shouted. "There's a ghost flying through the room." "It's really scary," said an old lady. "No, it's fun. I love ghosts," yelled a guest. The faster George ran, the spookier it looked. But he tripped on the rug and flew through the air. Now he was trapped. "Stand back, everyone," said Aunt Harriet. "Let me take care of this." "Well, George," she said, "you certainly gave us a good scare coming dressed as a ghost." "George," said the man with the yellow hat, "what are you going to do about the broken lamp?" "Don't mind the lamp, George," said Aunt Harriet. "I never did like it. You've made up for it by making my party a big success." "He should win first prize," someone shouted. When the party was over, they got into their little blue car and drove back home. Curious George goes to a bowling alley. "Let's go to the new bowling alley, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "The famous bowler, Lois Taylor, is giving a demonstration. The newspaper reporters and the TV cameraman will be there." They got in their little blue car, and off they went to the bowling alley. A crowd of people was standing around a TV camera. "You can go and watch, George," said the man. "But remember, don't get into trouble." How did they make a television program? George was curious. He tried to see what was going on. Above the crowd was a long pole with a microphone at the end. George leaped up and landed on the pole. Now we could see what was going on. A reporter was talking to the famous bowler. The crowd was all around them. George leaned down to get a better look. He leaned over a little too far. "The microphone's tipping," the cameraman cried. George slid down the pole and landed on Lois Taylor, the famous bowler. "Get him out of here," cried the reporter. "He's interrupting my program." "He's spoiling my grand opening," shouted Mr. Manelli. "Somebody catch him." By now, everyone was shouting or laughing, or trying to catch George. George slipped through the reporter's legs, dodged in and around the people, and ran to the nearest bowling lane. At the end of the lane was a strange machine. It was the pin setter, a good place for George to hide. "Let's start the demonstration," said the owner. "I hope nothing else goes wrong." Now the crowd could watch Lois Taylor. She picked up her bowling ball, aimed carefully, and rolled it down the lane toward the pins. All 10 pins went flying. Everyone clapped. The ball came back, and the famous bowler picked it up. She had to wait until the machine scooped up the pins and set them down again. But the machine didn't move. "Oh, no," cried Mr. Manelli. "The pin setter must be broken." He pushed several buttons, but nothing happened. The machine just didn't work. Lois Taylor was angry. "How can I give a demonstration if the pin-setting machine doesn't work?" she asked, and walked off. Mr. Manelli was angry, too. "What am I going to do now?" he asked. "Wait," someone cried. "Look down there." Everybody looked. The pins were being picked up, but not by the machine. 4 hands reached down and set them in their places. It was George. Now the famous bowler could bowl again. George was faster than any pin-setting machine. "Great! A monkey for a pin boy," shouted the reporter. "Let's get him on TV." "Good idea," said the cameraman. we'll interview George with Lois Taylor. After the game, Mr. Minnelli shook George's hand. "Thanks, George," he said. "I was mad at you for playing around with the microphone, but you made up for it by helping Lois Taylor finish her game." "Well, George," said the man with the yellow hat, "you didn't get a chance to bowl, but it looks as if you'll be on TV." And so he was.
Curious George, the curious little monkey. Here he comes, as happy as can be. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Why is he curious? Well, let's go and see.
Curious George goes to a gas station. It was vacation time. George was busy packing. "We're going on a trip in the car, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "We'll stop at the gas station for a map. That will help us find our way." The gas station was at the top of the hill. George got out and watched what the people at the station were doing. A woman was pouring water into the radiator of her big station wagon. "This will help keep the engine cool on a long, hot trip," she said to George. In the garage, a little red car was high up in the air on a lift. The gas station owner was standing under it. He smiled at George and said, "I'm changing the oil so the car will run smoothly." A man and a woman were trying to hitch a camper to the back of their car. "Let's hurry," said the man. "We're already late." "I know we're late," said the woman, "but it's safer not to hurry." "I'm going to get the map from the gas station owner," said the man with the yellow hat. "You hop back in the car, George. Wait there for me and don't get into trouble." George got behind the steering wheel. It was fun to turn the wheel and pretend to drive the car. There were all kinds of knobs and buttons and switches on the dashboard in front of him. And next to the steering wheel was a large black handle with a red tip. What was it? George was curious. It was the handbrake. He pushed it down and suddenly the car started to roll down the hill. It was fun to feel the car moving, but before too long, the car was going too fast. George was scared. He didn't know how to stop the car. What should he do next? He pushed a round black button and the radio came on.
"People, here's the latest news,"
said a voice. Then George pulled a long yellow switch and the windshield wiper started. Would it stop rolling if he pulled the same black handle with the red tip? It worked. The car came to a stop at the curb. "Help, the camper! It's rolling down the hill!" The camper had come unhitched and was coming down the street. At the bottom of the hill was a traffic light. It was green, and people were about to cross the street. What could George do? He had to make the people stop. Quickly, he climbed the nearest telephone pole. Then he jumped across the telephone wires to the middle of the intersection where the traffic light was hanging. He held onto the wire with his hands and twisted the traffic light with his feet. Now the red light faced the people, and they stopped right at the curb. The camper sailed through the intersection and stopped at the bottom of the hill. All the people from the gas station came running. The owner, the woman with the big station wagon, the man and the woman who had been trying to hitch the camper to the car, and the man with the yellow hat. They had seen what happened from the top of the hill. "Thank you, George. Thank you for saving the people from our runaway camper," said the man who had been in such a hurry. "Next time, I'll stop rushing and be more careful." All the people at the curb thanked George, too. "I'm so glad you're safe, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Now we can begin our trip." George and the man with the yellow hat got back into the little blue car and drove off.